Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate.
We believe that there's an option for every student.
We are there to help students and serve them. It's our mission.
And education is transformational. It changes lives.
I got it fixed, yeah. Thank you. It is 12 noon and we will begin. Just one housekeeping matter. Please silence your devices. Today is Thursday, April 11, 2019, and this is panel number 3302 entitled, Oops, I Said It Again, Normalizing Taboos. I'm Albert Hand, I'm the moderator. We have 1 hour and 10 minutes for this panel. We're going to allocate 20 minutes for panelists' opening statements. They'll have about 7 minutes or so each, following which we'll have a 20-minute period where panelists can correct mistakes that they may have made, respond to other panelists. It'll be a discussion amongst panelists, and then we'll have 25 minutes or so for questions and answers from you guys. As always, we give priority to students in their questions. We no longer use microphones. In this CWA session, we will utilize both the CWA app, which I assume that you are familiar with, but we'll also do note cards. If you don't know how to use the app or you forgot your iPhone, raise your hand. We have 3 producers, and a producer will come by and give you a note card and a pencil, and you can write your question out. The producers will deliver stacks of these note cards to me. On the note card, please note if you're a student. Our panelists, the lead off in our order is Lux Alptraum. Is that good? Yeah. Yeah, okay. She's a writer. Oh, their biography, you guys know this by now, but they're biographies for all of these guys in the program, and I'm not going to read the biographies. I'll just highlight that Lux is a writer commenting on sex, feminism, and pop culture. She's published in the New York Times, Hustler magazine, and she has a new book out, Faking It, The Lies Women Tell About Sex.
And
right?
the truths they reveal.
And the truth they reveal.
Yeah.
Next is Alex Barta. She's the founder of a company that offers botanically based solutions for common ailments. Next is Itulio Cardoza. He has a career in technology and among other things founded Last Mile, a nonprofit that provides education and career training for inmates in prison. With that, there's nothing else here. Let's have the opening statements from the panelists.
Yeah, so first I'm just going to say that my book is available at Mackey and I believe in the campus bookstore, so please pick up a copy of it. That will make me very happy. And yeah, so we're talking about normalizing taboos. Part of my background that's most relevant to what I'm going to talk about now is that I have, over the course of the past 20 years or so, worked in various capacities relating to the adult industry. I have worked in the production end. I also, for several years, ran a site that covered the adult industry. So what I'm going to talk about now is the normalization, not just of sex as a taboo topic, going from being taboo to normalized, but specifically commercialized sex from both the consumption and the production ends. And the way that the way that both sex work and consumption of porn have progressively become more normalized is through the internet. So let's talk a little bit about how that happened. About 20 years ago, a little bit longer, before the internet really enabled porn consumption to become pretty normalized, if you wanted to consume porn, you had to go to a store or maybe get a catalog, and you had to purchase or rent or whatever a video from another person. Now that was a huge improvement over the days when you had to go to an actual theater and watch porn movies with other people. But you still had to go out, you had to interact with another person, you could consume the porn privately, but there was still a pretty high barrier for a lot of people because maybe you didn't want someone seeing you walking into that special section in the video store. Maybe you were really anxious about the people who were working at the store recognizing you and telling someone or invading your privacy in that way. So a lot of people, even if they were interested in consuming porn, it was too high a barrier to actually attempt to do that. Once the internet, once porn started moving onto the internet, we saw something totally different because now if I wanted to consume porn, I didn't have to leave my house. I didn't have to leave my bedroom. I was able to just go online on my computer, possibly in total privacy, and go onto the internet and find whatever I wanted and have this total sense of privacy where it was just the porn producer producing something, putting it online, and I was then consuming it. As porn has become more likely to be free and freely distributed, now I don't even have to put in my credit card. Now nobody has to know my identity. I can go onto a site, access something for free on this very discreet and private device, and no one else ever has to know. And so what that has done is made porn consumption significantly more common by making it more private. Now, somewhat paradoxically, the fact that porn became more private and therefore more comfortable for people to access means that we all started to realize that, well, I'm watching porn, I think my friends are watching porn, everybody's kind of watching porn. And suddenly it became less scary to talk about because we knew there was this critical mass of porn consumers and that our porn consumption was not necessarily going to make us a freak or a pervert, that we kind of knew this was an accepted behavior. So you started seeing people becoming more comfortable talking about porn consumption publicly through the fact that it had become normalized, through it becoming significantly more private. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have the normalization of selling sex or selling sexualized content. Now, the way that this happened actually started in a similar manner because the internet made it vastly easier and vastly more low stakes for pretty much anyone to get involved in the adult industry in some capacity. You could be, and this is a story that has happened multiple times, you could be a college student in your dorm who decides that you just want to make a porn site. And if you have a camera and an internet connection, you can make it happen. You don't have to go to LA, you don't have to meet porn producers, you don't have to commit to the industry in as full-fledged a way as you might have had to in an earlier era. Likewise with escorting or full-service sex work, you didn't have to find an agency, you didn't have to go to a street corner, you could just put up an ad on the internet. And that made it feel a lot safer for people, that made a lot of people who in a previous era would have never considered getting into sex work more comfortable doing sex work. But it wasn't just a matter of more people doing sex work or more people feeling comfortable doing sex work. When we had the explosion of social media, you saw sex workers, both new ones who may never have done sex work in a previous era, and also people who come from populations that have historically done sex work. They now suddenly had a platform to cut out the middleman, cut out the journalists, and express their concerns, talk about their lives, and promote their own agenda to everybody through things like Twitter, through social media. And I've had sex worker friends for quite some time, and I've noticed, especially in the past decade, that like many of my friends who aren't in sex work or aren't connected to sex work, their opinions about sex workers have changed a lot. They've seen it's gone from something where this is like, oh, this is just something like poor, desperate, sad people do, to something where people are like, oh yeah, I follow this sex worker, I'm aware of what this porn performer thinks about politics. And they're starting to see that sex workers are just individuals. They are people who are doing a job. And that has come through social media, again, enabling people who once would have been hidden away to publicize their experiences, their views, and help a population that never would have had contact with sex workers understand what sex workers need, what sex workers want, and what sex workers are working towards. And just to cap it off, I will say that for me, one of the biggest signs that sex work has become significantly more normalized is that in New York State, where I live, there are currently multiple state legislators. So a couple of members of the New York State Assembly and a couple of members of the New York State Senate who are currently working with sex workers and sex worker advocates to craft legislation that looks to fully decriminalize sex work in New York State. That is huge, and that is something that is very, very recent. The idea that politicians would even deign to take sex workers seriously and listen to them, let alone work with them, is a sign that things have dramatically shifted.
Perfect.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for that. Tough act to follow, too. So again, my name is Tulio. I just want to say thank you for everybody for having me here today to be able to speak on this subject as well. I did want to make one quick correction, though. I'm not the founder of The Last Mile. I'm one of the founding graduates. Chris and Beverly Parenti are the founders of The Last Mile. And I'm very thankful for them to do that.
Julio, could you get more into the mic?
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. Let me know if anything,
That's good.
if I need to adjust. All right. So with regards to this, typically, you know, I really love to speak from the heart when I'm here and speaking about any of the panels that I'm in. But I promise to be a little bit more analytical with this one as well. I myself am a formerly incarcerated person, and I experienced what it was like both going through the prison system and going through the, I guess you could say that the best way to put it is going through the experience of being victimized after I'm already there as a consequence of a criminal activity. And being released, one of the things that I realized is that I was very fortunate to have the foresight to prepare for being released, to prepare for approaching an employer, and to prepare to have a really tough conversation that at that point I feel was still fairly taboo. It's only been very recently that it's almost become cool to be in prison at some point. And that's kind of scary, but it's getting to that point. And so really what I want to discuss is that, again, from my own experience, when I went through this system in 2005, even back then it was not really as open of a climate as it is today. But more importantly, with the work that I do on a day-to-day basis with software developers that have been trained inside of prisons that are now being released and trying to find gainful employment. We're talking about men, we're talking about women, we're talking about juveniles that are trying to get into educational systems after being released so they can get more training and get employed. What we have found is that really the conversations that we're having with employers, the conversations that we're having with community members has been very positive. But it's really only been positive because the approach that we've been taking is to the core of everything, which I think it's part of what you're talking about, Lex, with what has helped sex work industry really humanize people is being transparent with folks, putting people's actual emotions and putting people's actual thoughts on social media. When we started our program, our participants used to actually have moderated social media tweets posted on the internet for them so that people can get to know what it was like to be an incarcerated person, what it was like to be working through the struggle, and what it was like to have thoughts and dreams of the future. Transitioning back to where I'm going with this, the interesting thing now is that fast forward many years, we have people that are transitioning into tech industry, whether it's self-employed, like myself, I have a full-time job, I'm also self-employed. We have people that are working for small to medium businesses, and we have people that are transitioning into working for very large enterprises. Most notably, we have people that are working at Slack.com, which is a messaging platform for large teams. I believe they became a unicorn in like a year or something like that, so that's over $1 billion valuation. Last time I checked, they were at like $6 billion. And the really interesting thing is that in creating an employment pipeline, what really helped to remove the stigma and to remove the taboo, if you will, is to just be transparent. And in that real, I guess, like simple statement, what's been really interesting is that transparency, I think we borrowed from other industries, we borrowed from other people, but it has definitely created an opportunity for people to come back, be looked at as a human that had a comeback story, that went through a really terrible experience but learned something from it, understood what it was like to go through it, and can articulate why their future is very different for them now based on what they've experienced in the past. I'm very happy to report that we tell people, like, you got to believe in the process, but with the work that we've had inside of our own organization and with the work that I've had with other people in other organizations, or just frankly community members, I've even had people come up to me in these types of conversations, these types of panels after we have side conversations, and tell me, hey, what can I do to really improve my chances at getting a job? Like, I did this and I don't know what to do. And really the underlying theme of everybody that I've seen is successful is being transparent about it, no matter what it is that you've done. I would like to just kind of more or less I guess, put two different points of like how broadly this success level has had. Again, myself, I'm really just like a geek. I'd like to put myself on the not very special side of things. I'd like to put another person who I'm just blown away by how much he's achieved, and really his achievement was based on hard work, transparency, and being able to just be an outlier. It's a friend of mine, and his name's Sean Hopwood. Some of you may have heard of Sean actually through 60 Minutes about 6 months ago. Former bank lawyer, bank robber, went through the prison system, was peer pressured into being somebody's prison house lawyer, and he discovered that he was actually really interested in this stuff, and after being released, advocated on his behalf and said, look, this is something I really want to do, and was able to grow that advocacy and be able to grow that transparency into today being a tenured law professor at Georgetown School of Law and a practicing Supreme Court attorney. This is kind of one of those things where, again, he is an outlier for sure, but I just want to state that as a community member, if I needed to have my case be in the Supreme Court for whatever reason, I would not at all hesitate to have somebody who's been formerly locked up represent me in court. And I think that small businesses, again, back to them, they're really finding that they don't mind having people who've been incarcerated represent their businesses on some kind of a technical level, or some kind of a sales level, or some kind of a communications level, because they know at the end of the day, these are actually hardworking people that are trying to prove something to themselves, prove something to their communities, prove something to their families, and really just meaningfully contribute. I'm really proud to be a part of this society that is really trying to pave this path forward for others, and I'm really proud to be here with other people that are great panelists that are potentially teaching me and our organization and all of us here how we can continue to move forward with normalizing some of these stigmas that are deeply ingrained for a long time, or potentially new things that are coming as a result of technology. So, thank you.
Allie, before you begin, let me just say that I'm not getting many questions, and I only have two actually, and they're both note cards. So if you want to have a good discussion after the panel is through, please submit questions. And with that, Allie, go ahead.
Perfect, thank you. And everybody, I'm standing because I have two rods in my back, which if you come to the 180 degrees flipping your life trajectory panel lately, the two of us will be on there. So that'll be a lot longer intro than this one. But I am the founder of Nunamed, which provides botanically based solutions for healthcare needs. And so with that, I have a question for you all. How many of you have had a UTI or urinary tract infection during your lifetime? Raise your hand. Oh, you're an honest audience. I was thinking that we wouldn't have that many hands, but 1 in 2 women get a UTI during their lifetime, and so that's kind of where I come in. And what I have to say in terms of taboo, if you walk into a room, especially with older men, like my dad's age, and you go in there and you say, oh, I have this startup and we focus on UTIs, their faces a lot of times just go blank. And so, like the sentiments you've heard right here, there's tremendous power in terms of conversations and normalizing things that seemed obscure or taboo in the past. And so I think having dialogues and being at events like this definitely leaves us all open to that. And I'm someone who would not buy tampons for myself until college, and I absolutely had to because I was so embarrassed going into a drugstore and going, oh, it's that time of the month again. And so I just think that being here and having these conversations and talking about it is a huge step in the right direction. And thank you all so much for being here.
Okay, we have a period of time for panelists to talk amongst themselves.
Yeah, so I guess I have a question that I would love both your thoughts on. I mean, the things that we are talking about now are things that we're really glad to see be normalized. And I guess I'll share my thoughts on this in a sec, but I would love to know your thoughts on what are some taboos that shouldn't be normalized, or how do we differentiate between things that are taboo and shouldn't be, and things that maybe are normal and should be taboo, and things that should stay taboo. I mean, for me, one of the reasons why I got into writing about sex and writing about the adult industry was it was very confusing to me that sex was something that we all know is pretty fundamental to human survival, that most of us would say is generally a good thing. It's certainly a good thing for humans to keep doing. But that, once you photographed it, it was suddenly bad. And that the act of committing sex to a photo somehow made it bad. And that never made sense to me. And so I was like, I want to normalize this because I think sexuality is an important part of life. We should be more open about it. And I think certainly, like, people who have been incarcerated, oftentimes it's terrible that you come out of your sentence and you're still stigmatized and you're still pushed away by society, even though you have fulfilled your responsibility to society. But yeah, so those are things that I certainly think should not be taboo. But when I think about what are things that I think should still be taboo, and I think murder should probably be more taboo than it is. I think that rape should be significantly more taboo than it is. And I think that, a lot of times for me, the line is it something that is harming other people? Because then I think it should be pretty taboo. Or is it something that is just quote unquote socially unacceptable because of our discomfort and because it's foreign to a lot of us? So things like sex work, things like being formerly incarcerated, things like sexual health, for me fall into the latter category. But I would love your thoughts as well.
Yeah, I'd just love to jump in real quick because I think, like part of the reason why like some of our own areas that we care about have been normalized at this point is because somebody didn't like it, but the rest of us had conversations about it anyways, and to the point where it got to be a movement that people realized needed to be discussed and people realized needed to have some kind of action on it. When you bring up the example about like rape and murder, I totally agree with you that the actions shouldn't become more commonplace. Yeah. But I just want to make sure that I'm understanding your question. I think the conversations around this should totally be more commonplace.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I've met, unfortunately, people that have made those kinds of decisions in their life. It's not unfortunate I've met them, it's unfortunate for them that they've made those decisions through the work that I'm doing. And I got to tell you that like a lot of what has helped them to continue to change their life into a better trajectory, regardless of whether or not they got released, is just being able to have those dialogues because they were the ones that really needed to work this stuff out in their head and figure out like, why did they go that route? Yeah. And I think that we as a society, we're going to be dealing with subjects that are really outside of the prison more than we're going to be dealing with things that are in the prison. So like, I would just be really supportive. I guess my perspective is being more open about just being real with people. But as far as like those actions, I think that's so hard to peg down, to be honest. It's like a statement without an answer. Yeah. I wouldn't.
Yeah, no, I will say, to clarify, I think it's important that we are able to talk about sexual assault, that we're able to talk about murder, that we're able to talk to people who have done it and regret it and reintegrate them into society. I meant more that like, I don't think it's a thing that should be encouraged to be done.
Yeah. Yes. So to your point too, Lux, I was thinking about it, and for me, the line in terms of sex talks, my mom's sitting right over there, and goodness knows I never wanted to have the sex talk with her. And so it's funny, since you were so open with it, I still don't want to have the sex talk with my mom. And I'm 30 years old and married, but I just think it's interesting where we all come from different places too in terms of growing up and how we receive information and are educated on those things, because we absolutely have to be. And I think there's a role in education that we could get a whole lot better at that too. And one question I had for you actually that kind of feeds on your question was, where do you draw the line in terms of being open about these things, especially with porn, and then at the same time protecting younger kids? Like, you don't necessarily want pedophiles or children creating sex videos when they're 12 years old because they don't know better. And so how do you navigate that?
So this is a topic I talk about a lot, actually, and I'm very happy you asked me about that. So what we're seeing right now, we've historically seen ever since the internet made sexualized content more common and easier to access, we've seen this movement that says, like, we are going to hide everything. You know, we used to have these filters like Net Nanny. Now we have in the UK, it keeps being like, just like Brexit, they keep kicking the can down the road on this one, but they have the Digital Economy Act, which is supposed to be effectively a nationwide porn ban, where you have to register with a database if you want to access adult content to prove that you are legally of age. And we're seeing a lot of, again, there's a lot of this attitude that it's like, we have to hide this content, otherwise kids will find it. We have to hide this content. We have to put it behind a wall. We have to make it more difficult to access. I want to state very, very clearly right now that I am not saying that 5-year-olds should be shown hardcore pornography. That is not what I want you to take away from what I'm about to say. But I think that when we wall stuff off, we have this unintended effect of often walling off really important information. Because it's one thing to say, okay, we're just going to put porn behind a filter, but what counts as porn? Because to a lot of people, information about safer sex is porn. Information about queer people is porn. Information about sexual health is porn. And so you end up seeing, it's really becomes difficult with these filters, and you end up seeing a lot of like really important content and information that keeps people safe getting walled off away. Also, you often find that a lot of porn doesn't get walled away and kids will still see porn. What I think is more important and more effective than just hiding away the stuff that we're uncomfortable talking about is creating a society where if a kid sees porn, it's not the end of the world, because they have been educated about sex, they feel comfortable talking to their parents or other trusted adults, and they have the ability to have it put in context. I was raised in a home where, you know, dialogue about sex was encouraged. You know, I was raised to not feel ashamed about sex and sexuality, and it was sometimes very embarrassing as a kid. But when I first saw porn, which for me wasn't until I was like 16 or 17, I think, it wasn't terrifying for me. It wasn't something that I was like, this is what sex absolutely is. It didn't warp me. It was something that I knew was a fantasy. I knew sex was complicated. I knew sex was very different for every person, and it didn't shape my sex education because I'd already gotten a sex education. So for me, and it goes back to this idea of normalizing taboos, if we want kids to have healthy relationships towards sexuality, if we want them to not be harmed by running into pornography, if we want them to be able to say, oh, somebody wanted to touch me in a place and that doesn't feel comfortable, and want them to be comfortable talking to their parents about it, I think we have to be significantly more open about sex rather than thinking that we can hide children from sexuality until they're 18 and then suddenly everything will be great.
As a parent, I appreciate you saying this, actually. So
Also one thing, if you are a parent and you're looking for resources for younger children, amaze.org has really fantastic sex ed videos that I just want to plug them.
Love it. So, I just want to actually kind of follow up to that. I completely agree that, like, having an educated kid that knows about what they're getting into, that understands the subject matter, that understands some of the more I guess, important elements of it. I mean, they're not going to get it all because potentially, and this is the scary part as a parent, like, like I know like young kids are, 9 years old. They're already, they've all got phones since probably 7 years old. And you don't know what they're doing necessarily unless you're really geeky and you can put all these filters on their phone, which I think the majority of people can't. I've never met a family that has any of these things set up except for one. And like, I know a lot of different people with kids, but I totally appreciate what you're saying, but I think that it goes like really in line with a whole lot of different issues that are like in our community. Like let's take for example, marijuana in general, like recreational marijuana, medical marijuana. That's totally commonplace. I live in a city, San Francisco, where I am half a block down the street from a cannabis club, and the people that own that place like literally come by and clean in front of our house every single day, and security goes by to make sure that nobody's doing anything. I appreciate that from a neighbor perspective, but that does mean that like my kids have to have a conversation about like what is marijuana, what are drugs, what is the difference between abusing and not abusing it. And I just got to say that my wife and I both feel really, really strongly about being open with our kids, and it's actually made a huge difference in what they do. I mean, they've been around people, unfortunately, that's what they took, and I didn't want them to, like build an image that that's what they should be doing in their life is acceptable and commonplace. But it's really interesting that they didn't freak out and immediately say like, I got to do that. That's so cool. It was kind of more like whatever. Back to my phone. Gonna look at porn. No. Right. But the thing is like I think in general like that conversation of really just bringing that in there, like I so appreciate what you said as a parent. I think the other thing that I notice as a parent that really concerns the hell out of me, and it goes in line as those actions, is this: every time I see a generation of young people, it seems like the generation that they are, or the generation that's after, has allowed them their perception of what is taboo and what is commonplace acceptance. Like their definition of it seems to be a lot more broad than my own comfort zone. And I think maybe like that's why, for example, I had a lot of issues when I first tried to get out and get a job, because most people that were giving me jobs were older generations where they grew up, and that wasn't a good thing. Like if you were in prison, that means you were a bad person. Get away from me. And now it's more of a conversational piece. And like I'm looking at my children, I'm looking at other people's children, and I'm terrified sometimes when I'm being passed up by a gang of motorcycle guys doing wheelies on the freeway. Like there's like 30 of them, at least in my neighborhood, that happens. And that's the part that to me is like, how do we address some of those things? Because like, there's a whole lot of things that I think from a behavior perspective aren't necessarily all the taboo, but like, boy, are they getting crazy. And like, I don't know how do we like de-escalate all that stuff. Yeah. And I'd love some perspective from other people. No, this is not a parenting panel, so I apologize. But I guess sex, drugs brought me to rock and roll and all that other stuff. So I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's a hard question.
All right.
But I mean, I think having conversations. It's funny when you bring up like the kids and drugs. I think there's this idea of like, oh, when marijuana is legal, which I know it is here, like, oh, all the kids are going to be doing it. But it's like, if you are very open about like your drug use or your marijuana use or whatever with your kids, then it's the boring thing that their parents do. I think like that's actually one of the things that people don't realize about like talking with young people about taboo things is kids tend to, especially when they're rebellious teenagers, want to reject everything their parents stand for. And I think this idea that like, oh, if you talk to kids openly about stuff, they're going to go do it is really inaccurate. I mean, as someone who's been a sex educator with youth, I think oftentimes talking openly about taboo topics with kids and being honest, it can A, build trust, and B, take the mystery away from these like bad behaviors. Like if you're honestly told what drugs are going to be like and why they might be harmful, but whatever, that becomes a lot less appealing than it's bad, don't do it. So yeah, I mean, I think just by normalizing and talking about stuff, we often take away the romanticism behind a lot of these potentially harmful choices.
Well, and I just think too, when sometimes people don't want to have those conversations, since going back to when I was young and the sex ed talk, my parents definitely wanted to have that conversation. I didn't. And I think that's where resources like you mentioned, amaze.com, come in, because even if you're talking to someone and they don't want to hear what you have to say, if you can point them in the right direction, you never know what little seed you might plant. And so it could be on their own time reading a book or checking out a website, but don't lose hope when the walls are put up.
Do we have questions?
We do have questions.
The books
You want to go to the questions?
Yeah, I'd love to go to questions.
Sure.
Okay. When I saw this panel and was asked to moderate it, I said, oh boy, taboos, what we're going to do is talk about sex. Right? And we've done a lot of that, and Tulio has added, I think, another layer of interest when we're talking about taboos. But just to talk, not about sex, but to talk about taboos, I'm 78 years old, and and my wife and I talk about this. In my lifetime, the world has changed enormously. I suspect that someone who was born 100 years ago, looking back 100 years, would not have seen the kinds of changes that we've seen. Having talked about sex and incarceration, though, this is a cluster of questions that I'm kind of conflating. What taboos, focus on taboos, what taboos remain? Someone has suggested mental illness. Do we talk about that? Someone has suggested death as a taboo. Something else that we don't talk about is maybe not so much as polygamy. There must be remaining taboos. What are they? Should they remain taboos? How do we deal with them?
So I'm happy to talk about mental illness for starters. Speaking of mental illness as a taboo, I think it's absolutely still taboo to openly disclose that you have a mental illness or have history of mental illness. Not maybe less so maybe with things like depression and anxiety. Those are starting to get a little bit more normalized, but certainly certainly something like borderline personality disorder, bipolar disorder, and in my case, OCD, which I will disclose. I've disclosed in other panels. I'm actually very open about it, and I've written about it, but in the fall of 2017, at the age of 35, I was diagnosed with OCD, which in retrospect, I probably had my entire life, but it just hadn't been diagnosed, and I had been in and out of therapy. Nobody had diagnosed it, and that does actually tie back to taboos because talking openly about mental illness is so taboo. The idea that most of us have about what mental illness looks like is from the media, and the media very, very frequently misrepresents what mental illness actually is. In my case, I am not obsessed with counting. I am not obsessed with cleanliness. I am not like turning the lights off and on a certain number of times. A lot of the things that people associate with OCD are not actually how my OCD manifests. In my case, a lot of it was much more in my head, which also made it harder to recognize, and it was about having violent thoughts that I couldn't get rid of, that I was really uncomfortable with, or this fear that I would do something inappropriate even though I knew I didn't want to do it. There was also like some of the stuff about like I would have like a chip on my coffee table, and I was very convinced that if people saw it that they would think badly of me, so I had to keep it covered. But there were a lot of things that like I sort of just knew in my head. I was like, I guess I'm anxious, but I had no idea of what OCD actually was, so I did not recognize it in myself. And when I got diagnosed, that connected me to really fantastic treatment, and it is now managed. But for other diagnoses, something like borderline personality disorder is frequently misrepresented. People are scared to get diagnosed, are scared to tell people they have it, because it is portrayed as just, you're crazy, and you're gonna be violent, and you're gonna do really difficult things, and like, you're gonna ruin your life. And I have friends who have borderline personality, and yes, sometimes They are difficult to deal with, but also they're fantastic people who just need access to resources. But yeah, I do think we are starting to become more open about mental illness. With regards to borderline personality disorder specifically, Pete Davidson on SNL has been very open about it. But I think it is something where the taboo actively harms people, and it's so important that we normalize and we chip away at our stereotypes of what it means to live with mental illness.
Another area that I think we all think a lot about fairly frequently is politics. And just the experience that I've had is being on one side of the aisle versus the other. I've worked extensively for both sides, actually. I worked for the governor of Virginia when we had a Republican governor. Then I worked for the mayor of Charlottesville, who is very, very liberal. And I recall back when Trump was elected, going to class. I was getting my MBA at Darden at the time, and the reaction was very polarizing. And I think it's tricky because whether you are excited or dismayed, the block gets there in terms of dialogue. And so we've talked about having these conversations and needing to have conversations, and I think my public policy background is that a lot of these conversations, rather than labeling someone one thing or another, can be very dangerous, as we all know, and instead having dialogue about different issues and different policies rather than parties could take us all a really long way.
Yeah. Anyone else want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I just want to say I agree with
a personal confession. I'm a conservative Republican. I live in Boulder, Colorado. I did not vote for Trump, but I can attest that Trump in this community is taboo. And maybe deservedly so, I don't know, but it's something that I know people who live around here who did vote for Trump, and they will not publicly confess to it. And you know, I'm sort of saying that one of the things that is being talked about here is transparency and being able to talk openly. And I'm glad that you brought up politics. There are, believe me, very strong political taboos, and I think if you went south of Denver, that you would find the same thing, but on the reverse side of the coin.
I will touch on, just since somebody brought up, I think, non-monogamy, polyamory. I mean, I do think that in a lot of the country, what I guess I'll call non-normative sexuality is certainly still taboo. I mean, we still live in a country where if you engage in BDSM or some kind of kink, you could potentially lose your children. It's entirely possible that you would go through a divorce and your private sex life would be held against you as a reason why you are not fit to be a parent. People, can be judged at work because of their private sex life. People who have multiple partners still face anxiety around opening up about that, because we are in a society where monogamy and monogamous marriage is still viewed as normal and is still viewed as what everyone is supposed to do, even though that's actually a relatively recent standard. I think we are starting to at least open up conversation about it, but these are things that are still taboo. And I think it's worth questioning why, if somebody's sex life is consensual, if they're not thrusting it in everyone's face in a way that feels like harassment, by which I mean like coming to the office and putting on a live sex show. I think it's worth asking like why someone's private life and their own way of finding fulfillment in their relationship, why that is taboo for the rest of us who don't ever have to be involved in it. So, yeah, other questions?
Okay. Anyone? Julia, it's a question from a student. It sounds like you're saying that it's gotten easier to deal with having a history of incarceration. Do you really think that's true if in the age of the internet You can go online and find out almost anything about anybody. Does that, has that?
Yeah, okay, so I'd really love to answer this one. So with regards to, like, I want to respectfully answer this one and say it's not a good thing to be incarcerated. I think it's great to send people to prison that deserve to go to prison so they can have time to think about and be removed from the things that put them into that situation, process, pay their dues to society, and come out a better person than they were when they went in. Equally so, I think that we could do a better job as society at providing services while they're incarcerated so that they come out better equipped to handle things in society. And the expectation that somebody, when we throw away the key and they are released eventually, can come out and function without any issue is a little absurd from my perspective, because there's a lot of prisons where if you act up, they'll give you psych meds to keep you under control. Or if you act up, they'll throw you in the hole and you'll stay there for 6 years to keep you under control. And then you come back out to society and they're your neighbor, and then you wonder why they get all aggro when there's like a piece of garbage next to their garbage can outside, because they wouldn't dare do that outside, and they haven't like coped with dealing with other people or simple things, right? So there's a lot of problems, but I think with regards to like, is it getting easier? Like, it's a politically charged question. I think it absolutely is getting easier from the perspective of the stigma is not immediately removing all barriers or putting barriers into your path. But I think the reason why it's getting easier is because if you're able to be transparent, you know, for example, because you bring up this is a really good point. You can find out anything about anybody. Like if you Googled my name, you could probably find out my writ of habeas corpus that's inside of the Supreme Court, Ninth Circuit, or inside of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, where I lost my case there. Point being, and I tons of testimony. Point being is yeah, you can find that out. But if you just beat them to it and disarm it and like talk about that to people, like, yes, I was incarcerated. Yes, I did some really stupid things. Yes, like I finally realized it. Like, yes, I worked on these and these deficiencies. I'm working with different people to address those issues. Maybe I'm taking mental health programs that are helping me with that aspect, or I'm taking substance abuse programs that are helping me with that aspect. Like, we're all people, right? I mean, like, some of us are here that probably, you know, had they gotten caught would have been in prison, right? But we're accepting each other out here. So I just want to say, like, we're very much the same people. I think it's just your ability to communicate that to others that's easier now, whether or not, like, you know, in the age of internet, like everybody can find out anything about you. Like, use that to your advantage. Put personal branding out there to really de-escalate the situation. You know, put positive messages about what you're thinking about, so you can show people that you're a human being, not just some number. You know, my name for many years was V96634. Great. Nobody calls me that now. And it's because, like, I put a better image in front of myself for other people. I would recommend anybody that's going through that situation to just attempt it. And I think that, yeah, like the environment, from the perspective of employers, there's a lot more openness to hiring folks. That being said, you know, as an employer myself, like, if I'm going to hire somebody, they better bring value to my company. So my advice to anybody that's incarcerated is you better invest in yourself before you ask anybody to invest into you.
I just want to build off of that, because I think you brought up a really, really important point about getting out in front of things, like knowing that people are going to find stuff. I mean, one of the things that's been really fascinating, especially for instance, like young people who have lived their entire high school and college and young adult life on Facebook and been very public about stuff, is suddenly things like, oh, photos of you partying, photos of you drinking, they became very easy to find. And I think that that has helped force a more honest and open conversation about, like, what is responsible drinking? Like, what should I hold against someone who I am considering for a job? What is the appropriate level of behavior that I should expect? I mean, in some cases, we have employers who are being really, really restrictive and kind of forcing their employees to just not live online or to delete a bunch of stuff. But I think, like, when we kind of have this sort of warts and all social media presence, it enables conversations about what is and is not important and what should and should not be taboo. I think that's significantly better than and I am all for privacy. This is not a statement against privacy, but I think when people feel forced to hide something about themselves because it's stigmatized, that's not good. Like the idea that I should have to hide something that I have done, rather than, maybe say, look, I don't really want to talk about it, but yeah, that's the thing. Or make a decision like, this is private, but whatever. Like, the idea that it has to be life-ending, that someone finds out something about my past is troubling to me. I mean, as a journalist, I have a lot of media friends who have now taken to deleting all of their old tweets, or deleting their old tweets every few months, because they don't want to be judged by a past tweet, and they don't want to be judged by something. And that's, I respect that. I understand like wanting this like right to be forgotten, but at the same time, I'm like, look, I ruined my reputation a long time ago. People who want to work with me, the New York Times has published pieces by me. They still think I'm okay to work with. Like, the quote unquote shameful things about me are out there, and I don't feel the need to hide them, because I know that people who want to work with me can look at that and say, oh, I don't actually care about that. And that's the kind of people that I want to be working with.
Absolutely.
Do you want to respond to that, Tulio? Or? No. There are a number of questions that kind of combine sex with the stigma of incarceration, and these deal with predatory sex offenders. How do you fit a predatory sex offender into a world of transparency and trying to avoid stigma as one of the consequences of incarceration? And I think that's a question for both you, Lux, and Itulio.
Yeah, I mean, I will say I am more towards the end of prison abolition. I think a lot of the prison system is incredibly harmful, and that in attempting to punish people rather than work to repair the harm that they've done, we end up creating a really vicious and violent cycle. So as I said, I do think sexual assault is really, really terrible. I think sexual assault is a more nuanced topic than many of us would like to admit. I think I think all of us are capable of committing sexual assault, quite frankly. And oftentimes that's because we might assume something about a situation that's not true. We're not trying to harm someone, but we're just also not having open conversation. But I think for people who are actively trying to harm other people, I think for people who are maybe, again, like violent serial predators who know they're doing something wrong and are actively trying to harm people, I think we need to have an honest conversation about what is causing that for them. Is it something where that can be repaired? Are they someone who can be reintegrated into society, be someone who truly understands the harm they've caused and regrets it and wants to make amends? My goal is always to move people towards that, and I feel like Julio kind of mentioned that, if everything is so taboo that you're just like, you sexually assaulted someone and now you're a bad person, you must go away forever, you lose the opportunity to repair, you lose the opportunity to fix things. And I think that we do need to get to a place where we can have honest conversations about why people do bad things, and hopefully move them to a place where they don't want to harm other people.
Yeah, totally. So to add to that, though, I think, for folks that are like in that position where that's them, and they've done something that is just a heinous crime, or they've done something that really, from a social perspective, we just don't want to tolerate because it's behavior that's just very harmful to everybody. But we still have to deal with society. Like, what do we do with this person, right? Are they going to get out? Are they going to stay there forever? And if they are genuine and wanting to acknowledge their regret and work to make amends, like, I think part of it, like, that those individuals are just going to have to realize is the same thing that we all have to realize, but they're going to see a lot more of it than we are, is you just can't make everybody happy, right? Not everybody is going to like you, people are going to judge you by the color of your skin or the sex that you are or the sexual affiliation that you align with or whatever. Like those things, like we see like day to day. But those, like, whatever, I mean, my point being is like, that's not going to stop us, moving forward in life. However, for somebody in that position, like, they are literally being judged on whether or not they want to come back to society or if they can move into this neighborhood. And if they do move in this neighborhood, then everybody around them is like watching them like a hawk. And I'm not saying that that's a bad idea. I mean, like, political third rail, I don't want to touch that one. But I just want to say that from the perspective of, like, what we tell them is like, you're not going to make everybody happy, so figure this out and just be transparent with people, because the moment you're not genuine, you're lying, you're taking advantage of us all again. So
I mean, I also think it's worth noting that a lot of us are all too happy to forgive people who've committed sexual assault when they are the person we want to forgive. I mean, there are people who still, I think, support Harvey Weinstein, even though he has shown no remorse for what he did, shown no, like, years of just manipulating and abusing, or decades rather, of manipulating and abusing people. There are people who still want to forgive Bill Cosby. And I mean, I'm fine with forgiving people who commit harm and forgiving people who commit sexual assault. I think what's troubling for me is that right now we're in a mode where it's either I punish you forever or I just decide I like you and it's okay. And I don't actually expect you to do anything. It's just okay because I like you. And if we could move to a third position where we say, it's not that you can never come back from it, but you won't be immediately forgiven, and you have to do the work on yourself to help repair the harm that you've done.
I think just on a personal note too, when we lived in Charlottesville, we had a neighbor that we found out had a history of sexual assault and had gone to prison for it. And I think immediately you go, oh my goodness, that poor man, I hope that he's managed to make peace with his past and has a great path forward. And then we started talking to our neighbors and learning more about the situation. And there's an old law in Virginia where what happened was he had sex with his girlfriend who was 16 and he was 18. And the parents were very much against it. Her parents were. And that path forward is he ended up going to prison. And since then, he's had a really hard time readjusting to society. And I think sometimes we clump people, whether it is politically or otherwise, in these different categories without really looking at the ramifications they have for them down the road. And sometimes you just really need to dig in and figure out what caused something or why they were ascribed such a title or affiliation to.
I mean, like the sex offender registry, which a lot of us think is a really good idea, because it's like, oh, sex offender registry, great. Like, I want to know if I'm living near someone who might harm my children. But if you actually dig into the sex offender registry, yeah, you get people like that on the sex offender registry. You might get someone who was arrested for public urination on the sex offender registry. Like, there's like a wide spectrum, and all that happens is all of these people, because they've done something potentially minor, are now assumed to be violent pedophiles, because that's what everybody assumes when they see sex offender registry. And that's not harmful, that's not helpful, rather. That's just shutting down conversation and destroying some people's lives.
So how do we encourage opening the conversation back up?
Yeah, I mean panels like this.
Yeah, I think so.
I would hope, but yeah, I mean, I think like certainly like when people bring up the sex offender registry, I'm like, but what does that mean? And I try to talk about the fact that actually this list is not good, that I don't support it, and I think coming up with alternative models for, again, like pursuing justice, for pursuing reparations and fixing harm, rather than just saying you did a bad thing, you go on a list.
Awesome. A question, well, this is a student question. What about taboos surrounding gay life? Kissing in public, or even gay men as sexual creatures get pushback, or two men dancing. We all support equal rights, but the acts of homosexuality still seem to be taboo. Are changes coming? And then a related question is, does anyone talk about masturbation? I could hardly ask the question.
Well, so it's funny for me to hear. I'm wondering if the one about gay life is coming from a younger person, just because, I mean, as someone who's...
The student.
Yeah. Okay. So I was in high school in the 90s, and it was vastly more taboo. So, I mean, the fact that gay marriage has been legalized is huge. Certainly where I live in New York, like, same-sex affection is very normalized. Granted, it depends where you are. I know in parts of this country it is not normalized at all, but I think we are starting to get there. That one, I mean, yeah, if you are in your teens now, I'm sure it seems very bad, and it seems like everything is still so taboo because we haven't achieved full equality. But I think for those of us who remember when Ellen was like the first gay person on TV, and when Ellen came out and it was a huge deal in the 90s, we've come way, way far from that. Also, masturbation, likewise. I remember when the Surgeon General was fired for recommending masturbation as a healthy behavior, as healthy sexual behavior. I think we are now in a wildly different space. I mean, I can tell you that Walmart, which does not carry Cosmo, Walmart carries sex toys, and specifically carries a line that they approached a manufacturer about making. I mean, they're not like super explicit, like giant dildos. They're more discreet vibrators, but Walmart sells sex toys in their brick and mortar stores. If that's not a sign that we are more comfortable with masturbation, I don't know what is.
Lux, I have to ask, do you know why Walmart doesn't carry Cosmo?
I mean, because they are actually a conservative. It's because of their conservative background. I don't know exactly what about Cosmo is offensive to them, but I know that they do not carry it.
Interesting.
Yeah. Anyway, anyone else want to say anything about masturbation or gay sexuality?
No, I think it's definitely
In prison.
what's that?
Masturbation in prison.
Oh yeah. Well, actually, that's the part of what I wanted to mention. Actually, is there is definitely gay sexuality issues in prisons, and definitely masturbation issues, and gay sex in prison. I think it's, if you think it's hard and taboo out here in certain communities, like it is very polarizing subject inside of prison systems in general as well. You have people that are, by design, housed in a facility for men that they don't see themselves as men, and because they haven't had the surgery to fully convert into a woman, for example, or that they don't have the right to be around somebody that they aligned with. What ends up happening is you have a lot of different situations where they're taken advantage of. Masturbation is something that I think everybody in prison goes through at some point or another, especially if they're there for a long time. But if you have a person that is, affiliating as a different sex, they're going to be a target. And, you get this kind of stuff in prison a lot. People are taken advantage of and victimized that way, and equally so. I think that what you see is they're fulfilling their own needs. Is this a really common thing? I mean, I could understand like why the person's like, I'm having a hard time even writing this question. Yeah, I mean, it's a very deeply rooted personal thing, right? But yeah, it's super common, and I think that when it comes to the way that people are being taken advantage of, or those kinds of things, we need to have a lot more conversations about it. There's definitely the prison system is not like set up for this kind of a thing, and it's because it's a warehouse, right? That's what it is. It's a giant warehouse with a roof and bars around it, and people need to fit into their box.
Yeah, I have trans women friends who've been incarcerated in men's prisons, and it's really, really terrible because, yeah, as you mentioned, that can often put them at extreme risk of harm.
And I think that's kind of a taboo in a sense, because like, who really wants to talk about that, right? But like, that is totally something where a person that goes to sleep in a large room like this can wake up being assaulted by somebody they've never seen before because there's 250 other people living here. Yeah. And then if they speak up, they could be killed because gang affiliations or race car affiliations, and they are subject to just dealing with it. It's a really serious and tragic situation that we have. And I think actually, one of the earlier questions were, what are some of those taboos? I say anything because I hadn't thought about that one. But I think that this is actually like one of those things too, where it's really tragic, it really happens, and they are definitely underrepresented a voice in those subjects. So I'm really happy that it was brought up. So thank you to whoever wrote that.
Remaining taboos, what are they? What's next to fall? What's next to be confronted, to be dealt with?
So I think sex work is in the process of being dealt with. We are now at a point in time when both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and many other major human rights organizations have declared support for sex work decriminalization. I think I mentioned earlier that there's active legislation being proposed in New York State about sex work decriminalization. We're not at a place where I think that's going to happen anytime soon, but it is being discussed, and I think the taboo around that is starting to fall away. I think that the taboo around being non-monogamous and not being in a monogamous relationship is starting to fall away. Taboos around alternative sexualities, again, we talked about being gay, but also, being asexual and not wanting to have sex at all. That's a taboo that we're starting to see fall away. Really everything about allowing people to pursue whatever sexual identity and sexual behavior, consensually, of course, makes them feel the most fulfilled. I think those taboos are starting to fall away. Not sure what is next beyond that, but I do think that those are ones that we're going to see more discussion of in the coming years and potentially decades.
Any other thoughts?
Hopefully politics. Yeah.
Okay, well, I guess that's it. Thank you very much. Thank the panelists. This has been very enlightening. And thank all of you for attending the Conference on World Affairs.